You're listening to Coast Business Radio with Mike Ryan.
Salvatore Babones holds a Master's in Mathematical Sciences and a PhD in Sociology from the Johns Hopkins University. A proud American by birth, he has lived in Sydney since 2008. Salvatore is a political sociologist at the University of Sydney and an elected member of the National Committee on US-China Relations. His book, The New Authoritarianism, Trump Populism and the Tyranny of Experts, was named Best on Politics 2018 by the Wall Street Journal. Salvatore is also the author or co-author of several books and academic research articles. His research on the global economy has a particular focus on China, including the Belt and Road Initiative, global trade networks, and Australia-China relations. Salvatore is an adjunct scholar at the Centre for Independent Studies. The centre promotes free choice and individual liberty and defends cultural freedom and the open exchange of ideas. Salvatore, welcome.
Thank you.
Now, one of your publications noted in February that China's coronavirus epidemic is likely to cost Australia's export industries. Then it was up to about $12 billion in lost revenues. Seems such a long time ago. What are we looking at now?
Well, that is a long time ago. That was the first week of February. We made those projections. That was for my work at the Center for Independent Studies here in Sydney. And it was only a projection of lost export revenue for the first half of the year on the assumption that the whole thing would be over by May or June.
Not on a long shot. It's here to stay for a while.
On a long shot. But the estimates turn out to be right on target as far as universities are concerned, because when universities later announced their coronavirus revenue losses, they were bang on what we had said in the paper. And unfortunately, this is going to continue. So, sure, $12 billion for the first half of the year. I think that's probably a reasonable estimate of Australia's lost export revenues. Now, that's nothing compared to Australia's lost GDP, which has turned out to be much, much greater. The real problem for exports, of course, is that services exports will continue at zero for the rest of the year and who knows into 2021. Iron ore has actually outperformed, so a lot of our concerns about a slowdown in Australia's iron exports were completely unfounded. We turned out to be entirely wrong throughout the crisis. Iron prices have actually risen. Who would have thought? And China is buying more iron ore than it was before the crisis. 2020 is shaping up to be a record year for Australian iron exports.
But who knows? I mean, just today, in the newspaper, or the whisper was that that's going to be on the hit list next, and coal.
Well, we'll see. They're talking a little bit about coal, but of course Andrew Forrest has been so outspoken in favor of China that China has actually taken moves to streamline Australian iron imports, whereas they used to inspect every single shipment of iron ore at customs. They've announced streamlined customs procedures. So who knows? It's really iron ore that's the biggie from an economic standpoint. And China seems to want to let that continue while targeting politically sensitive, but in volume terms, much, much smaller exports of things like beef and wine.
And wine and beef both go together, so we can't have one or the other.
Well, you're talking to a teetotaling vegetarian, so it's nothing to me. But of course, it's a serious problem for Australia's farmers.
Now, universities, they're feeling the pinch. The exposure of these institutions to a slowdown in international student revenues from China must be, for a $40 billion industry, fairly terrifying.
Well, Australia's universities allowed themselves to become extraordinarily dependent on China. I wrote a paper on this back in August 2019 that got a lot of coverage. If you were to make a league table of universities in the world by numbers of Chinese students, outside China, Australia has 7 of the top 10 spots.
Oh my God.
Australia is more dependent on international, but especially on Chinese students than any other university system in the world. And of course, now that has slowed to a trickle. I think it's even worse than what's been reported in the papers because I don't think they're going to come back. Australia's universities are desperately trying right now to restore the pipeline of Chinese students. They're lobbying for a safe passport, essentially, for students coming from China. Their argument is that China doesn't have coronavirus anymore. We don't have coronavirus anymore. So students should be allowed to come from China in a kind of direct pipeline to Australia starting next semester. I don't think China is going to want to send them.
So where do they go?
Well, China is now facing decades of declining student numbers, and it's a problem for Chinese universities, which are starting to have to close down and repurpose their facilities. They need the kids back home. Now, it would have been politically extremely difficult for China to have told Chinese parents that their kids can't study overseas. Remember, these are middle-class, upper-class parents in China, many of them members of the Communist Party themselves. It would have been politically difficult for the government to cut off international student travel before the coronavirus. Now that the coronavirus has hit and they can cut off student travel on health grounds, I think they'll be able to make that stick. That is, I think that come this August, September, the Chinese government will quite legitimately tell its parents or tell its students that they can't travel to North America and England. Now, North America and the UK will almost certainly still have endemic coronavirus come this northern summer. And I think they'll tell them they can't start the new school year in the Northern Hemisphere. When it rolls around to our next school year, starting in February 2021, frankly, I think that we'll just be an afterthought. Those restrictions will just still be in place.
But then what about the universities or the educational institutions that the Chinese were frequenting before all this went to ground? What happens to them? Are they going to be around?
Of course, that's our problem, not their problem. The universities can well withstand the financial shock. They don't want to withstand the financial shock, but they can handle it. And the reason they can handle it is that most of this money coming from Chinese students has not been poured into core educational activities. It hasn't been subsidizing people like me who teach mainly local students in arts faculties. This money has been poured straight from the business school bucket, where all the Chinese students are going, into high-profile research initiatives. Unlike universities in the US and UK, which mainly fund big research institutes on private philanthropy, Australian universities have funded their big research initiatives out of current receipts, out of international student revenue. That's why Australian universities have zoomed up the rankings in the last 10 or 12 years. I mean, Australia now has 7 universities in the global top 100 research rankings. Now, that sounds like a great accomplishment until you realize that Australia is a small country of 25 million people. What are we doing with more high-ranked research universities than China, Germany, Japan? We're third after the U.S. and second and third to the U.K. by only one university. U.K. has 8 universities in the top 100. We have 7. It's really pathological, and it has developed because we've had this outsized revenue from international, primarily Chinese students for the last 10 or 20 years, and that revenue has been simply poured directly into funding research institutes. Now, I say Australian universities can well survive the crisis because most of those researchers are being hired on term appointments. That is, these are not tenured permanent faculty members. These are people who've been hired for the duration of their research project. Now, I don't want to be hard-hearted. I mean, every job loss is a catastrophe for the person who loses it. But these contracts were funded on this kind of, very soft money coming from current revenues. And I think these jobs are going to have to go.
I can almost hear someone swallowing the glass of $30 Pinot at the moment. What's happening? We're going to
well, I mean, let me put it in perspective. I mean, people like me, the whole rationale for a research university is that people like me are researchers who then turn around and teach in the classroom using what we've learned from our research in our classes. And that's why universities do research. What we've seen in the last 20 years at Australian universities has been a separation of research from teaching, so that we've seen an entire class of people hired purely to do research, mainly in the sciences and in medicine, where they generate large numbers of publications. They don't teach students. They have no interaction with the rest of the university. Their job is essentially just to produce journal articles that then feed the university's rise up the rankings. That is, I think, is an unhealthy development for any university, and we've seen a lot of that here in Australia.
What are your thoughts on the Australia-China trade relations? Is it just a war of words, or do we have, some say, the schoolyard bully beating their chest a bit more than normal?
There definitely is a schoolyard bully, and I think Australians are waking up to the fact that dealing with China is making a deal with the devil. But that said, I don't think that China's threats are as meaningful as everyone makes them out to be. They are talking about warning Chinese students not to come to Australia. Well, no one's coming to Australia anyway at this time. They are talking about scaling back purchases of Australian agricultural products, but they have to scale those back anyway because under the terms of their Phase 1 trade agreement with the United States, they've got to buy hundreds of billions of dollars of U.S. agricultural products. So a lot of what they're doing is making a lot of noise over things that are happening anyway. The Australian products they really need, the iron ore, they're still coming here to get.
Have we begun to better manage Chinese foreign investment in our primary industries and resources?
Well, there is now a federal investment review of all foreign investment, and I think it's a bit ridiculous that in order to placate China, that review is placed on all foreign investment, including from the United States and United Kingdom, which is a bit ridiculous that U.S. and U.K. investment in Australia should be subject to review just so that Chinese sensibilities aren't upset. Whether that review is effective, honestly, I don't have details on individual cases. I don't know how effective it has been. At least people are now aware of it, and I think that's really the big issue. It's not that Australia shouldn't deal with China or take Chinese investment. Of course, Australia should be deeply engaged with China. It's that people should be conscious of what they're doing. They should do it with open eyes. They should be aware of the risks involved, and I think Australia is now waking up to those risks, or at least Australia outside of Victoria, which I know we'll talk about.
That's right, the People's Republic of Victoria, led by Chairman Dan. Now, the Belt and Road Initiative, what sort of strings do you think would be attached to the $25 billion Belt and Road Initiative to Victoria?
The offer is financial. The strings are political. China's Belt and Road Initiative is not really an economic integration program. This is something I've studied very closely, and it isn't really benefiting China economically at all. It hasn't redirected trade towards China. It hasn't resulted in profit for Chinese companies. It is, from the Chinese standpoint, a subsidy being given out to compliant countries, or in Victoria's case, states, in exchange for below market financing. And what Victoria is so desperate to get is part of that pot of underpriced Chinese finance. Will the finance be underpriced? It probably will be. Is that worth causing a disruption, a rupture within Australia's domestic federal system? I think probably not. I'm not Australian myself. I am American. I'm only a friendly voice here. It's not my politics. But when a state of a country decides to run its own foreign policy in defiance of the national authorities, I think that's really a recipe for trouble.
It's. I'm just thinking about the states here. I mean, Victoria does. They had this national cabinet with the coronavirus, and they all get together, and it's a bit like out of Monty Python, and they get together. Yes, we'll all agree, and then they go out and do their own stuff. And I was thinking, well, we're not alone here. It happens in the US. You've got, again, the People's Republic of California. I mean, there's another one. So is that, you think democracy in a way sort of almost breeds contempt?
No, I'm a big fan of federalism, and I think that the fights between the states and the federal government in the United States, while they have perhaps impeded the coronavirus response in some cases, for example, in New York and California, I think it has enabled states to have better coronavirus responses. For example, in Florida, which everyone thought would have a killer epidemic, but Florida has used its autonomy to really run a first-class public health program, despite the concentration of elderly people, to avoid the worst of the coronavirus epidemic. So I'm a big fan of federalism, but federalism really is something for domestic politics. It's not something that should spill over into foreign affairs. It's frankly a bit ridiculous for states in a federal system to be making deals with foreign countries. It's just, I don't know if it's legal or not in Australia, but it's certainly unseemly.
We had Dave Rubin on last week talking about government, and some say we want big government, some say we need small government. He says, no, we actually need good government.
Well, that's certainly true, but I think we get good government from federalism. I mean, the closer politicians are to the voters, the better. And, you won't hear me condemning the fact that, states can go their own way. I mean, I may condemn the way a state goes, and I may not agree with the way a particular, state or local government acts, but that doesn't mean I'm against state and local autonomy. I think state and local autonomy is a good thing. And it's great that, if Victoria wants to go its own way, that we here in New South Wales don't always have to go with it.
What do you think will be a significant legacy of the coronavirus and China's position on the world stage?
It's really been a wake-up call for everybody. In the initial phases of the outbreak, there were a lot of voices, especially coming from academia, saying we need to stand with China, supporting China's response, admiring China's totalitarian lockdowns. But I think people are now waking up to the fact that, that wasn't all it was cracked up to be. There were a lot of problems involved, and that China, through its deceptions, through refusing to share information about the virus, through its politicization of the World Health Organization, that China really has unleashed a killer virus on the world. And you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to realize that China could have and should have cooperated back in, December, January, February, instead of stonewalling. And I think people around the world are now starting to realize that, a fish stinks in Denmark, except it's not Denmark, it's Beijing. And I really don't think China will get as easy a ride in the future as it has in the past.
Yeah, I'm actually really, really quite, not angry, but just shattered that the world that we used to know really is no longer there. It's like living in some B-grade science fiction movie.
And I suspect we'll find out that a lot of that was overreaction. We'll find out what we could have done better, should have done better. But, that's not going to help China. I mean, everyone, when the investigations start rolling in, everyone is going to start realizing that China is the country that made this happen. The virus didn't just start in China. It was, fed in China, spread by China. Chinese policy led to it. Well, I'll give you a concrete example. African countries have no ability to care for people with coronavirus. I mean, many African countries don't even have hospitals in entire states of their countries. Yet, China put strong pressure on Ethiopia, which is the travel hub between China and Africa, to keep flying to China. In fact, Ethiopia is still flying to China. Ethiopian Airlines flew through China throughout the crisis. Now, other African countries lobbied Ethiopia to close down this transport hub through China. But of course, Ethiopia is a major recipient of Belt and Road Initiative funding. China built its entire transit system in Addis Ababa for free. China built a headquarters for the African Union in Addis Ababa. China built a headquarters for the African Centers for Disease Control in Addis Ababa. So now, African countries are waking up to the fact that China, which for years was viewed as, a source of easy cash, well, now they're realizing it's also a source of, death and destruction. And they're starting to condemn people in their own continent who have enabled this and who've been too beholden to China. And we're going to see that story repeated over and over around the world. Who knows, it may even come to Victoria eventually.
Salvatore, thank you very much for your time. Enjoy the Sydney weekend. I'm sure back in Jersey where you're from, it's probably still pretty cool there.
Well, it's a cold, blustery Friday in Sydney, at least by our local standards.
Salvatore, thank you very much.